Well, hello, everyone. Veterans, JK VA employees, everybody watching, welcome to another terrific Tuesday here at the Veteran Lane YouTube channel, where we talk about VA disability. As always, I'm your friendly VA accredited attorney, Matthew Lang. Hey, our topic today is competency and incompetency. And yeah, I know those terms might hit a little wrong right away, so let me specify really quick. When we talk about competency and incompetency, underneath the VA law and VA disability, veterans, we're not here challenging your intelligence. That's not what those words mean in this situation. We're also not challenging your overall ability to live your life. But what we're referring to is your mental capacity to manage your own financial affairs, which includes the disbursement of your VA benefits without limitation. So I'm going to refer to 38 CFR 3.353 as our piece of law today that talks about the incompetency and competency. As I do that, I'm going to give you an overview of what the process looks like, veterans, when there's a determination for competency or incompetency. And then what I want to do is really highlight a few errors that I'm familiar with from my experience inside the VA and from what I've seen out here on this side of the table, to hopefully provide that additional education to avoid those errors to the VA as well. Because again, we're looking to make a smooth process in the end between veterans and VA alike, to maybe one day not needing me in the middle to make these arguments and to represent. All right, so veterans, here's what we're talking about again. So here's the definition of mental incompetency underneath 3.353. It's a mental incompetent person is one who, because of injury or disease, lacks the mental capacity to contract or to manage his or her own affairs, including disbursement of funds without limitation, just like we already discussed. So we're going to key in there later on to some of the terms in there, but mental capacity is the huge one. We're talking about your mental capacity here, veterans. Now, if we look further through the law, we're going to find underneath D that there's a presumption in favor of competency, veterans. So this is really the good news for you here. So ultimately what we're saying here is VA has to presume veterans you're competent. So when they render that decision to grant you a benefit, they sign that evaluation, they give you the effective date, you are presumed competent. You will receive your monthly benefits for you to handle as you feel fit. You are competent. Now, the question is going to arise, well, at what point then do we get to the incompetent piece, and how does that arise? Well, we start looking in the law here. We can find in even paragraph C here, and even other parts of the law perhaps, where we start talking about a review of all the evidence. And how that medical evidence has to be clear and convincing and leave no doubt for the VA. This section is really highlighting that the idea of incompetency could come from, again, medical evidence, veterans. That could be a VA examination. It could be treatment records from the VA. It could be treatment records from outside the VA, for example. One part where it's pretty common is in say a mental health exam or a PTSD exam. The question will have to be answered by the examiner as to whether you're able to handle your own financial affairs. Now, this is a checkbox question like the rest of the DBQ. It's going to say yes, you're able to, or no, you're not able to. When that box is checked no, it's going to likely prompt the VA to go incompetent. Veteran is incompetent. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean you're incompetent to handle your own affairs and your finances here, veterans. It's just the idea that now the evidence is prompting the idea of the possibility. That question should have a rationale behind it as well. But at this point, got to turn to the whole record and the evidence of record as we find in the description of 3.353C, in making the determination whether that evidence, medical evidence, is clear and convincing. So in short, what I'm saying, veterans, is medical evidence is usually where the question is going to come up at. Something's going to be written in there that's going to highlight the idea that you don't have the mental capacity to handle your own financial affairs. And when that happens, the VA then has to make a determination as to competency and incompetency. Now, if they're going to make a determination of incompetency, veterans, the law here in paragraph E will remind us that veterans, you do have a due process right. You do have a constitutional right to due process. So, which means the VA is not going to just give you a decision right away that says you're incompetent to handle your own financial affairs and go ahead and flip your world upside down immediately. The idea here is they have to propose the decision now of incompetency. So when they propose that decision of incompetency, veterans, what you have now is the opportunity to provide additional evidence to support that you are competent, if you would like. You can provide additional argument that you are competent, and you even have the opportunity to request a hearing with the VA to provide, again, additional evidence, additional argument, or even testimony. Once the due process period has expired, so let's say you did provide additional evidence, veterans, or you did do a hearing, or you provide that argument. Well, VA now has to go back and consider all of that evidence as well as relooking at the evidence prior and determining whether they're going to keep the proposal intact and make a decision that says you are incompetent, or whether they're going to overturn the proposal and make a decision that says you are competent. Now, even if you didn't provide any evidence, during the due process period, the VA still got to go back and relook at the proposed decision and the evidence that was there to make sure the proposal was done correctly. Because one thing that I was always learned in the VA is that the last person to touch the file is still responsible for all the errors prior. So they should go back and look at whether that other decision was right. Now they get that decision again of making competent or incompetent at this point. So veterans, if the VA, for whatever reason, after all the review of everything, says you're competent, everything goes back to the way it was. You continue receiving your monthly benefit to do as you please with. Now, if the VA says, no, you're incompetent, you don't have the mental capacity to handle your financial affairs, then we walk into a decision that says incompetent, and now we go through a process for assigning a fiduciary to help you handle those affairs. I'm not going to go into that whole description here in this video because I think it'll take me a whole nother video really to explain that piece. And I really want to focus in on just the overview of the decision flow and some of the errors that we see in those decisions. So veterans, keep in mind, you'll probably be visited by another VA employee whose title, as I know it as, is a field examiner. You may be contacted again by the VA to set up a fiduciary. Could be your spouse, could be another person, could be another entity of sorts, but we won't get in a deep dive on that. Just know that could happen in the process. Now, let's say veterans, the VA has given you that decision for incompetency. One thing to keep in mind here is that's not a permanent decision. That decision still comes with appeal rights as well. So you can still appeal that decision and get that overturned with additional argument and evidence. Now, perhaps veterans, there's a acceptance that at the moment in time, your condition is leaving you with a lack of mental capacity to handle your financial affairs, and you agree that the help is needed. Well, you can accept the incompetency decision at that time, but then what happens over time, perhaps, is your disability gets better, and now you have the mental capacity down the road or in the future to handle your financial affairs. So this is what makes the decision not permanent, is that veterans, now that your condition has changed, now that you have that mental capacity again, you can approach the VA and go, I have the mental capacity now to handle my own affairs and I would like to do so. And you can provide the evidence and the argument again at this point to show that you are now, well, competent underneath the law, and the VA can now go in and review that evidence and make that determination. And it is possible now that you could receive a decision that says you're competent. So it's not permanent is my point. There are points where it can still change. So that's the overview of the process. That's what we're looking at. So evidence can come in that can prompt everything to question competency or incompetency. Otherwise, veterans, you're presumed competent. You'll get the opportunity more than once to provide evidence and argument and to try to overturn the decision of incompetency if it gets that far. If you disagree with it, And then if you happen to agree with the decision, you can let it write out and go ahead and accept all the fiduciary assignments and all the other stuff that comes with it. All right, so what do I want to talk about next? Outside of the overview of the process of what happens and how we get to the point of competency or incompetency is some of the wordage, some of the verbiage, wordage. I'm not sure if that's a word, but some of the verbiage, sorry. Some of the verbiage in the law and some of those errors that I have seen inside the VA working there, and then I've come across a couple as well on the outside, because I want to kind of go through those to help, again, the VA as well. Again, the platform to educate everybody to make an easier process. So I highlighted in the definition to begin with, as you recall, that it says mental capacity. Now, sure, we have an injury or disease that could cause the lack of mental capacity. The idea here is that, sure, veterans, you could have a physical condition that does alter your mental capacity to handle your financial affairs. Is it possible? Yes. But I think the concern here for the VA side is the idea that if the box is checked on, say, a VA examination that says you're not capable, veterans not capable of handling their own affairs, financial affairs, and it's due to a physical condition, you got to ask yourself, is that physical condition really just a hurdle? And do they still have the mental capacity? Because I'm going to say that a lot of times what I've seen is the physical condition is just a hurdle to handling those affairs. It's not that they lack the mental capacity to understand or to handle those affairs themselves. They just have a physical hurdle in making sure that those affairs are handled. So remember, the law is saying mental capacity, not just the idea that there's a hurdle in the process. It's mental capacity. So I want to point that out because, again, that's an error I've seen. I think what happened in my time at the VA, at least, was mental capacity was not being understood as mental capacity. There were times I had witnessed that just a physical hurdle that didn't hinder mental capacity was causing the decisions or incompetency. The other things I want to really point out in the law too is when we go down and we look at paragraph C here, unless the medical evidence is clear, convincing, and leaves no doubt as to the person's incompetency, the rating agency will make no determination of incompetency without a definite expression regarding the question by the reasonable medical authorities. So you're going to have to, VA is going to rely on veterans, they're going to rely on the medical evidence, but I think the first part here that we got to look at now when we talk about potential errors is clear and convincing. We got to understand that clear and convincing is a burden of proof that the VA now has, is what the law is saying. So the burden is on the VA to prove with a higher standard than the usual preponderance of the evidence standard or the equipoise standard to prove veterans that you do lack this mental capacity through the medical evidence. So again, I found a lot of times that higher standard was not being applied in my career. Now, I'm not saying it's not necessarily today, but I have seen a couple where I think it's still being missed, but I can't say it's just one or two or the whole agency is missing it. We're not here to point any fingers. It's just the idea of saying that we got to understand what clear and convincing is. Because my concern is what I see is the checkbox on the VA exam gets marked and there's no real rationale behind that box. The box is seen as saying, no, veteran can't handle their financial affairs, and immediately incompetency is proposed. That I would say does not meet, from an education point of view, clear and convincing by itself. Because if we look further into this piece of law, we do find that it says that these determinations relative to incompetency should be based upon all evidence of record. All evidence. So the checkbox by itself, immediately the law is saying is not clear and convincing. You have to go through all the evidence. You've got to go through all the evidence of record, and there should be a consistent relationship between the percentage of disability, facts relating to commitment or hospitalization, and the holding of incompetency. So you've got to look at the whole picture. And one thing I've seen in error is that the whole picture doesn't get looked at. And what we have is ultimately an examiner who may have sat with the veteran 5-10 minutes, maybe 15, and made this determination of incompetency, but hasn't really provided a really good rationale. And then what we find in the VA treatment records for instance, or the private treatment records, other medical records, ultimately, is that the primary care physician says multiple times that, yeah, they got the mental capacity, they're fully coherent, they're able to handle their own financial affairs. But we find that will get ignored, and the proposal will come down for incompetency. So those are just some errors I've seen, and I want to make sure that we understand that the law says that's not a proper proposal for incompetency. You have to go beyond the checkbox on the exam. You can't top sheet the VA. You have to look at all the evidence. Now, remember, we also talked about the relationship between the percentages of disability and stuff. So I would say one thing to look at is if veteran is 10 or 30% for PTSD or another mental health condition, and there's a checkbox that says not able to handle their own financial affairs, I think now we have to really start asking ourselves, well, why is that percentage so low? That doesn't seem to come together with the idea that the veteran's unable to handle their own financial affairs. So the law is really saying, take the blinders off, look at the whole picture. You got to get away from just the checkbox. That's just my educational point of view on that there, and help some of those errors out, because we do see that when that's ignored, ultimately we take veterans who may have even mental health conditions and we add additional stress to them, only worsening their condition unnecessarily when the decision should not have been made. And then we talked about the due process period. Again, the VA's got to give you that due process, and that's usually not a problem. I usually see that work out just fine. It's the matter of understanding mental capacity and the clear and convincing burden piece of the higher standard and the reviewing of all evidence. As one last fun fact before I close this out, is one thing I've seen before and I've seen again recently, is that checkbox will be checked by an examiner that says the veteran's not able or capable of handling their own financial affairs, and then the rationale, little sentence or whatever they put behind it, will say ultimately that the household setup for the veteran and their spouse is just that the spouse pays the bills. Just because they have a setup for the spouse to pay the bills to keep things organized does not mean the veteran lacks the mental capacity of managing their own affairs or financial affairs. Keep in mind, VA, that there are cultures out there. There were definitely times in our society where it was more prevalent that it wasn't uncommon for one spouse or the other to handle those financial affairs, even though they both had the mental capacity to do so. Just another error I've seen, and I've seen it again recently, especially when there's other evidence that says veterans clearly got the capacity. So things to watch out for, things to be careful with. No reason to waste extra time. No reason to stress veterans out even more by making bad decisions. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is veterans, VA, dedicated VA employees, everybody watching. This is my overview of it, competency and incompetency. Veterans, I'm hoping you got some good information about this out of all this, because if you do see this come up, you may want to reach out to a representative who says, hey, I heard about this. I don't agree with this. Can we look into this? What can we do? And if that's your decision, always veteranline.com. You can schedule some time on my calendar. We can look at the evidence. We can look at your decisions, and we can talk about what we may be able to do. And then for VA, I think this is just crucial to point out some of the errors that I've seen, just so that if you happen to run across them again, you can avoid them and overturn them quickly to avoid any unnecessary delays in any claim processing or any unnecessary work or additional stress to the veteran. All right, everybody. Thank you again for being here. I look forward to our next topic next Tuesday. I'll see you then.